Good evening, everyone. My name is Erica Schmidt. I am the president of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute, and I'd like to welcome you all to this book discussion of Hannah Zeavin's book, The Distance Cure, A History of Teletherapy. Hannah is in conversation this evening with Linda Michaels, and I will introduce them in a moment, but I want to tell you a little bit about this program this evening is co-sponsored by two of my very favorite organizations, the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute and the Psychotherapy Action Network. The Institute, of course, has education programs for mental health professionals and others at all levels of their professional development, and also a treatment center that offers fee-adjusted psychotherapy to adults, children, and adolescents. The Psychotherapy Action Network is a really interesting cross-disciplinary organization, non-denominational, let's say. It's a grassroots organization that advocates for therapies of depth, insight, and relationship. Before I introduce our two speakers this evening, I just want to remind people that this presentation, including the audience participation, is being recorded. So by staying in the meeting, you will, through your participation, acknowledge and consent to any remarks that you make being recorded. Our format this evening is going to be a conversation between Hannah and Linda, but there will also be plenty of time for discussion and questions with the audience. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there's a Q&A button. At any point in the presentation, you can submit questions or comments, and we will get to as many of those as possible. So if you use the Q&A for that, I will be monitoring it. You'll also see that there is a chat function at the bottom of the screen, and you, of course, can use that to message the whole group or any individual in the group. So now let me introduce you to our speakers this evening. I realize that, I don't have to give directions to the bathroom. I just have to talk about recording the information. But I am so pleased to introduce to you Hannah Zeavin. Hannah is the author of The Distance Cure, A History of Teletherapy, and she is a lecturer in the departments of English and History at the University of California at Berkeley. She is also on two executive committees at Berkeley, the Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society, and the Berkeley Center for New Media. She's also a visiting fellow at the Columbia University Center for the Study of Social Distance. So you can see something about the scope of her interests, and I think this book combines them in such a sort of beautiful way. She is a former fellow of the American Psychoanalytic Association and now is an editorial associate for the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. The Distance Cure is her first book, and she is hard at work on her second book that's titled Mother's Little Helpers, Technology in the American Family. So you can see something about, I heard her on a podcast describe herself as having a lot of nerdy interests, but her nerdy interests, I think, are really quite fascinating, and we'll get to hear about them this evening. Our discussant this evening is my friend and colleague, Linda Michaels. Linda is a clinical psychologist in private practice, and she is one of three co-founders of the Psychotherapy Action Network. As I said, it's an organization that advocates for therapies of depth, insight, and relationship, and is on the forefront of promoting their value in our current mental health landscape. Linda is also a consulting editor of the Psychoanalytic Inquiry. She's a fellow of the Lauder Institute Global MBA program. So Linda also has an interesting background in cross-disciplinary interests. In addition to her PsyD, Linda also has an MBA, and she has a previous career in business consulting to organizations in the US and in Latin America. And last but not least, she is a proud graduate of the Institute's adult psychotherapy program. So welcome, Hannah, and welcome, Linda. I'm going to turn the conversation over to Linda, who will be the interlocutor this evening.
Thank you, Erica. Thanks so much. And thanks for all you do for both the Institute and PsiAN. We're so very lucky to have you. And Hannah, I'm so honored to be speaking with you tonight, and I welcome you and our audience. And I'd like to thank the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute and the Psychotherapy Action Network for sponsoring this event. As Erica mentioned, I'm a member of both communities, and I know all of us are really delighted to have you here with us to discuss your really profound and so timely book. It's so well researched and comprehensive, spanning the fields of psychoanalysis, media, technology, communications, relationships, very thought-provoking and very impressive. I thoroughly enjoyed it and I learned so much. And for those of you who haven't yet read it, I encourage you to do so immediately. Central to your book are issues of distance and intimacy, vulnerability, control, communication and silence, hiding and revealing, dependence and autonomy, trauma and loss. And of course, these are also topics of frequent focus in therapy, and now so much the stuff of our daily lives as we're making do through this pandemic. And while many of us may think we've discovered this brave new world of Zooming, you argue that technology and mediation have been a part of therapy and the frame since day one. While many of us are used to talking about the dyad, the therapist and the patient, you talk about a third. And maybe not in the traditional way or ways our theories conceptualize the third, but rather this triad of therapist, patient, and the means by which they connect or disconnect. And you really bring our attention to something, of course, that has been there all along, but I think something we've been avoiding thinking about, and how we've been avoiding consideration of this mediation or the technology that mediates the therapy, and really the distance and separation that are part of any therapy. And instead, we prefer to focus on the fantasy of intimacy and closeness. And you also invite us to reconceptualize the frame and also the role of empathy in therapy. And you offer some really provocative ideas about how understanding this important third can open the door to more effective integration of inner work with the external social context. So I really look forward to diving into all of this with you and our audience today. And I guess I wanted just to start out with asking, why did you want to tell the history of therapy as the history of teletherapy?
Well, firstly, thank you so much, Dr. Schmidt, Dr. Michaels, for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure. And for that really moving introduction to my book. I have to stop blushing so I can think. Why the history of teletherapy as a retelling of the history of therapy? There's always a kind of multiply determined answer for why we are invested in the things we're invested in. I don't need to tell you that. You know that better than I do. That's your part of your job. So for me, I had intellectually this kind of split, and it remains this kind of split dual focus. On the one hand, I'm very focused on the history of technology and media. And on the other hand, in another life, I would have been delighted to just be a Freud scholar left to sit alone in the Library of Congress for the whole of my life. And I couldn't really let just one or the other stand. And I wanted to think about where the media history of therapy is and was. And for Freud nerds, Freud scholars, we know that Freud really loved to play with the metaphor of media. This is kind of well known in media studies. It's well known in a certain kind of Freud scholarship. Analytic listening is like the telephone call. There are screen memories. Memory is like a mystic writing pad, and on and on and on. He just couldn't help himself. And I wanted to see what the real use, not metaphorical use of media were in therapeutic contexts. I started the project about 10 years ago, and there was already a whole appification of mental health care, Silicon Valley, but also New York, right before Talkspace and BetterHelp came to dominate the ecosystem, but that was already available. And I just knew there had to be a much longer history. And so, like any fake psychoanalyst, because I'm not a clinician, I started to go backwards in time, right, from the present, and wound up with Freud's real use of media to treat himself in his so-called self-analysis, and little Hans and many other patients. And that figuring out that history is what drove it. It has been here all along, right? I argue, and I think it's true, that actually the first analysis really was a teleanalysis before it came into the room. So they're coincidental, one begot the other, and that fascinated me long before the pandemic.
Yeah, just amazing. And just in and of itself, I mean, so much scholarship, but as we apply it to the pandemic now, I think it becomes so much richer. And yeah, mentioning Freud, and you say, I think we're often taught, and we often talk about his self-analysis, and you say, no, that wasn't really a self-analysis. That was really maybe the first distance analysis. Can you say a little bit about that and his work with teletherapy?
Yes, and I'll also just say, I can tell that the light is getting really bright. I'm in LA, which is not where I live. So if you just tell me, I'll go close the window.
It is a little bright.
Yeah? Okay, hold on 1 second. Okay. 1 second.
Okay.
I could tell.
Yeah. Suddenly there was this sort of flashbulb-like light.
Well, I am in LA. I mean, you never know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have my sunglasses handy.
Neither do I. Is that better?
Yeah.
So I mean, there were lots of hints to this idea that it wasn't really a self-analysis. Many people have written about it, and everyone who I was following their breadcrumb trail got close, but it seemed to be some hesitance to being able to call it what I think it is, which is just an analysis done over letter because of the mediation. Mm-hmm. And that was where I began to start trying to think about, why do we now, and why did they then, with really different media and really different cultures, sort of assume that whatever was mediated was lesser? Why is that the assumption? And it's one of the assumptions the book is really trying to take up. So I was looking at, this beautiful correspondence. It's a very strange correspondence between Freud himself and Wilhelm Fliess. Fliess was, for the uninitiated, Freud's best friend and then enemy during the time when Freud was most generative in like part one of psychoanalysis. So interpretation of dreams, psychopathology of everyday life, through the kind of 3 essays sort of approaching moment. They were done by then. And so they collaborated. They were very, very close friends, but they almost never saw each other in person because one lived in Berlin, Fliess, and the other lived in Vienna. And their correspondence, which is almost 300 letters, we only have Freud's side because Freud burnt all the letters from Fliess. Freud loved to burn stuff, his own drafts, letters by people that he became annoyed with or worse. But we have Freud's letters to Fliess, also an amazing story, because Marie Bonaparte, the princess, saved them from the Nazis and from further burning. So the letters really are, you can see, an analysis and other things too, but the whole self-analysis, so-called, is reported there. And Freud himself very early on says, actually, a self-analysis isn't really possible. You need essentially transference. And Fliess was supplying that. So like Masood Khan gestures at that in his work on their friendship. And I decided the reason we can't say that it's an analysis proper is because of media, because it was written instead of spoken. Yeah, and that became a driving concern of the book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But yeah, when you write about that in the book, it's so interesting because you talk about, their letter writing as kind of this playground for free association, and how they even referred to chatting with each other, and then having to wait for that next letter, and the issues of censorship that was kind of always in the background. I mean, so many of these issues that are so relevant to an analysis.
Yeah. I mean, what I tried to do is read the conventions of letter writing in Freud's moment and the letters themselves together to think about how Freud was able to create a space via kind of presencing over distance, and how he was able to turn that into an analytic space, but also how there are all these precursors to, say, free association that are actually properly written. So Freud sort of steals the idea of free association lightly, like many great thinkers do, from an idea about automatic writing, right? Write it all down as it comes to your mind. So there's both, right, this kind of supplementation, right? Let's pretend we're chatting. Let's pretend we're in the same room, a kind of fantasy of co-presence. And there's stuff that's really proper to letter writing that's going to allow for something truly analytic to take place. Before we even really can say what it is for something to be analytic, right? This is the first dream ever interpreted under a kind of Freudian method happens in that correspondence, right? So it is this kind of origin story for psychoanalysis, for teletherapy, so-called, but they really are happening together rather than, yeah, well, we have smartphones and a pandemic, right? It really is the same tradition, and a long one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's see, I wanted to shift a little bit, and one theme throughout your book, and that's also so important, especially today, is this theme of access and how to broaden the reach of therapy to be available to more people. I mean, there have never been enough mental health clinicians, and I doubt there ever will be, for everyone to have their own therapy. And so it's always been the struggle of how to make this more accessible, more affordable, more convenient, and all the obstacles people confront in obtaining this scarce help. And you write about Freud recognizing these very problems, and making some arguments that I think some people still try to make today, that analysis is cost effective because it saves people from so many medical problems that they would otherwise experience. But those arguments don't really hold much sway with insurance companies, or this long-term view is just not something that has ever worked. Could you talk about some of the experiments to increase access and what you see, what was learned or achieved through them?
Yeah, thank you. This is a tricky one. In the US context, there has always been this kind of lack, and it's a strange thing, right? We're seeing this right now in terms of what's being called the Great Resignation, right? Where everyone is quitting their jobs because they've had enough. I'm not going to do that job for $7 an hour. I'm not going to do that job for $11 an hour. On the one hand, we have this idea that numerically we have too few therapists and too many people who would make use of mental health care. And that's true. But we also have really terrible working conditions for many, many therapists. So even as we've added, the whole, idea of the PsyD or the MFT, these newer degrees, social work, then adding a kind of clinical psychology, and women almost entirely now dominate the field. I mean, the numbers are like 80+%. In social work, it's 96% women. Right? We have had a feminization of therapy, and it's still not been enough, right? And a lot of it comes from anxieties about big scale crisis, like mass crisis. And one thing I noticed in writing the book is that teletherapy almost always is innovated during crisis and then remains afterwards, because you don't get to just take back. And we can talk about where we're headed next. And we were a little bit in the before. So what I'm trying to say is after World War II, there is the addition of clinical psychology, like as a field, almost entirely women. At the same time, we're still in this super medicalized psychoanalysis, right? Almost entirely men, very expensive. Insurance doesn't yet look like what it looks like. Medicaid hasn't yet happened. And there is this real push that psychoanalysis is the cost-effective treatment. It has been tested in World War II. It can help people with real trauma overcome, the worst of war. So it will help the housewife on the Upper West Side or Upper East Side too. And at the same time, we see CBT rise in the 50s, 60s, REBT, then CBT. We see psychopharmacological drugs rise. We also see technology. So the push, that's the historical setting. And why? Because all three of those modes are going to try and batch process patients. They're not very interested. CBT now is a huge umbrella. So obviously, if there are clinicians in the audience, I'm not identifying all CBT, but as it's initiated, it's supposed to be a practice that's not dependent on the therapist. Beck and Ellis were super in on this, right? Which I write about in my book. They were like, we can do self-help the same as with a person. We can do workbooks the same as with a person. We want this to be the least dependent relationship. We find that disgusting. That's the psychoanalytic model. We want something really classic American. And technologists who also had been psychoanalysts originally, but turned their back on the practice, thought this too. Right? What if we could just make a bot? Right? And what if we could then see as many people as we wanted via technology? So that elusive fantasy has been there across the century, and it hasn't worked. So that's the sort of short answer. That kind of let's just automate therapy has remained elusive. On the other hand, there have been like really wonderful, much smaller scale experiments at the same time, born out of the same need, right? There are too few therapists and they're treated poorly. Let's do something else, like the whole history of the crisis hotline and all of its offshoots, which is very much a history of communities caring for themselves, by themselves, outside of expertise, away from the homophobic DSM, away from the sort of reach of the carceral, to provide a kind of care that, again, we would not recognize as properly therapeutic, but nonetheless is a therapy. So there's a lot happening across the 20th century. I could go on and on, but born again out of this impulse, right? How do we fix the supply and demand issue? Especially because therapists tend not to be everywhere, but be in very specific centers, urban centers. And then there's the whole rest of the nation. And that's just in the US. It looks very different elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as you're talking, it's reminding me, I think you have this lovely way of really encapsulating that trajectory over time, this the evolution from sort of the as if kind of approach to therapy that is grounded in the principles of psychoanalysis to this if-then kind of model, which is more focused on CBT principles and, of course, lends itself more so to that automation. Yeah, could you talk a little bit about approaches and yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So if we think of sort of psychodynamic therapy as being engaged in part in an as if kind of structure, around fantasy, around the unconscious, these things that disappear really, in the 1960s and 70s intensely. CBT, again, this is just what Beck and Ellis were up to, meaning the practice has obviously evolved. But Beck and Ellis were very interested in essentially treating the mind like an information processor. If you're thinking bad thoughts and you don't want to think them, think a good thought, reprogram yourself. This comes out of a really long tradition of, Norman Vincent Peale kind of The Power of Positive Thinking, right? Which he co-wrote with Smiley Blanton, who I vow to raise in every single talk I give because his name is Smiley Blanton, a psychiatrist in New York who's also a patient of Freud's, but very interested in a kind of Christian self-help as well. So Ellis and Beck are making that change. At the same time, and scholars like Sherry Turkle have really looked at this, as the computer is coming more and more into its own and eventually is going to seem actually quite warm compared to a kind of cold psychiatry and a cold medicalized psychopharmacological based treatment. So people are going to feel more willing to talk to a computer, and also therapeutics have become essentially computational. Right? If you're feeling X, here's Y. It's just a series of variables. And I mean, my phone is somewhere here. I mean, all of the apps that we use today are barely more sophisticated than those earliest experiments with taking CBT and making it automated. They look better. They have better graphics in 2021 than in the 60s, 70s, and so on. There weren't graphics yet. That's one major difference. But they're very much the same. So we can also talk about that. I mean, what you get with Woebot is barely more sophisticated than you would have had in 1966 with the first accidental therapist bot, say, Eliza. And it's all routed very much in that kind of predictive, short-term reprogramming of the mind. Yeah.
Right. And then it's like, what happens to, the role of the therapist involved in this kind of self-help type approach. And then the role of the relationship with the therapist, which so much research says is the key ingredient that makes therapy effective. I mean, what happens when this key ingredient is kind of deleted from the picture? That's what we're so concerned about, for example, at PsiAN.
Yeah, I mean, as one should be. So I just think of the kind of genre of gaming with a therapy bot as just different. I don't think it's therapeutic. I call it auto-intimacy. I'm not even in a way against it. I'm against many things that come with it now in its current incarnation, like huge, both confidentiality and privacy problems, huge data problems, which are very pernicious. And we can talk about that too. But, it's about being alone with oneself run through a medium. I compare it to sucking one's thumb, like as a child, writing in one's diary, a kind of little closed circuit of the self. Doesn't have to be terrible, but it's not relational therapy. And I don't mean they're like relational psychoanalysis. I mean, predicated on there being a relationship. It's just different, but it's often masquerading as such because there's what is called in human computer interaction, linguistic entrainment, right? Like you are talking to something one experiences, but in fact, you're not. You're really talking with yourself. And just the same as you might feel better talking out loud in the bathroom about your day. Okay, but this is not therapy, right? And I think one thing we're seeing in our contemporary moment is this really loosening of what therapy might mean, wellness, health, right? Partially because the FTC and FDA don't have oversight over things that proclaim wellness, really, but they do over things that claim therapy. And part of it is just super late stage capitalism, kind of self-care that totally defangs the politics of self-care, is all about getting ready to go back to work. And, a huge push to have employers offer 5 minutes of automated, no person CBT rather than take care of a copay for seeing a therapist, whether on Zoom or, in the room. That's a different distinction. But it has been brewing for some 60 some years, right? The kind of push for automated therapy. And it first starts actually not with technology, but with what CBT is premised on, REBT is premised on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned, the kind of the sales pitch now of, these apps and programs and technologies. The sales pitch is about, reducing costs, increasing worker productivity.
Always.
And reminds me about how you and I first met because of an article in the New York Times about Talkspace, which the Psychotherapy Action Network for $40 million. And we thankfully won that easily. But we were both quoted in that article. And when I read it, I thought I have to meet this amazing woman who says all of these intelligent and enlightening things about technology and therapy. And Talkspace is kind of literally, their tagline is therapy for all. Yeah. I think it really begs the question of what is therapy? And does anyone besides us therapists really care about that distinction?
Yeah, I mean, Talkspace, but it begs what is therapy and what is for all, right? So that's Talkspace tagline, but it's not just a Talkspace problem. There is a whole ecosystem. And I say that because of the thing you just referenced, that $40 million question. That I definitely don't have that kind of backing. But yeah, Talkspace, I know. Talkspace, therapy for all. They want you to feel like you're participating in a kind of push for access, right? That it is going to grant access. And access itself is really complicated because, of course, it is deeply economic, right? Therapy is predominantly unaffordable to the millions of people who might benefit from it. And it has been across a century, which means that therapeutic cultures have been very predominantly white and wealthy in the US context since their inception. But it's not just about economics. It's also about the way that they create a relationship that is, on the one hand, supposed to be frictionless, right? They'll take care of the referral. They'll take care of the setting and the frame. They take care of the money, the fee, right? It's plug and play therapy. And if you don't like your therapist, like swipe left. Is it left or right? I don't know, like Tinder logic. Anyway, but in reality, that's not what user/patient or the patient we now suddenly call users experience is at all. And it's been, it's not just the Kashmir Hill article in the New York Times, which was fantastic, but also the Molly Fisher article in New York Magazine, where patients get really frustrated and then they don't seek additional help. And they don't get what they're supposed to get out of the app. That Talkspace is a therapist to patient, human to human experience, and yet it rates horrifically by their own studies in terms of what they call therapeutic alliance. Whereas Zoom therapy is shown to be as effective as in-person therapy. So something's happening specifically there. And they take this moniker of for all, and they're charging patients essentially what you would pay out of pocket to see someone once a week in any urban center. So, and they're only licensed in like New York and California and a few additional states. So where is the actual access? Where is it for all? But the marketing is so smart, right? And that's part of what, PsiAN is up against, and your allies and people who are in solidarity with you about this real shift. It's not the tele problem there. There, it's the corporate problem. Yeah. All right. In my opinion.
Right. No, absolutely. And it is, developed and marketed, I think, like a lot of other slick apps and social media platforms. And the idea is to be sticky and to, there's also this idea you write about the role of enjoyment and pleasure. And I mean, I don't know if that's exactly what we would call real therapy, which, often involves a lot of pain, whether you're trudging to your therapist's office during a blizzard in Chicago, which I have some familiarity with, or waiting for that next session, or getting the bill or paying the bill. We don't really think about pleasure and enjoyment when we think about therapy. And we do think it's really important to understand why you feel badly and what you can do when you feel badly, and get some tools to deal with that. But the automated therapies are just, you write about, focused on enjoyment and pleasure, and so they keep people coming back using the product. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, I think you just said it all, right? That because they're games, or they're gamified, that's what we would say in media studies. They're built like games, these tools. They're supposed to be frictionless. They're supposed to be cute and pink and easy, convenient. And yeah, I mean, Freud really, he had a change of heart about this, but the first thing he does is set up the idea of the fee. It should cost you something, and you should not like paying for it, because then you'll actually do the work, right? That there's this very kind of masochistic, right? Like you should want to show up, and it should hurt. It should cost you something. So then Freud is like, okay, maybe not the money, but the spirit of that, right? That it's not always going to be good. Maybe it's not even going to be painful. It's going to be boring, but, and it's going to be boring for the therapist, Lord knows, but that's something to be sat with, right? And thought about. Where is it in the transference? Where is it in the countertransference? None of that is in play for these apps. Firstly, because again, none of them really are articulating like a theory that includes the unconscious, almost at all. Maybe individual providers, yes, but very rarely. So it's just supposed to be kind of lighthearted and about making you your best self, but in this very superficial way. And who doesn't want to be their best self in a very superficial way when it's just text your therapist and that's going to make me better. Like, of course, it's very compelling. And economically, it has been, very compelling, right? For them, they keep scaling it bigger and bigger. But no, I don't think we would call it truly like a therapy maybe period, but also therapy of depth and insight. Certainly not, if we can delimit that way. It's not supposed to be.
By definition, yeah. Yeah, and right, at the scaling, I guess my personal fantasy is that it has a limit, and the bubble will burst. I'm curious what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I think it's just good to touch in and make sure that it's clear that this is about a kind of corporate hosted either therapy that is connecting a provider to a patient, or there's no provider. It's just a mass scaled app. Yeah, I think that some things are showing a kind of ceiling and maybe a bubble will burst, but not only. So like the bad news is that Wysa and Wobot, which are two little chatbot therapists, each got $100 million in B series funding this summer. That's big. That's, I would say, probably bad news. They're really, Wobot is Google, no, Wysa is Google's. It has a cute little penguin as the avatar. You're doing therapy with a penguin. And like, obviously people who are into trans species stuff are like, that's great. And I'm a little worried about that, although it's very cute. I love it, to hate it. And then the talks-based BetterHelp model, I think there we are seeing some pushback, right? There was just this tragedy at a music show where a bunch of people died, and the artist partnered with BetterHelp for one free month. And then of course you'd keep going because it's therapy. And there was tons of pushback online from people who are not in the therapy world, are not advocates. They were just pissed off about consumerist use of tragedy, which they should be. And that was a kind of misstep. Or when a city partners with one of these apps to do the therapy for small towns, say, very few people sign up. which tells us a lot about a number of things, including that these apps, even though they're very slick in their marketing, that people are still allergic to them, right? Still want to stay away. But their numbers also still grow. So I think, right, we can point to the hopeful data, and we can also point to the less hopeful data. I don't think we really know what it's going to look like across time. I will say a lot of the apps I started writing about in 2013-14 were bankrupt by the time I had to file the book. So there was a lot more about apps, but many of them had gone under. And I didn't think it was going to be a very interesting reading experience to see about all these startups that had failed, maybe as a separate essay, but, so I think there's also high failure rate, high turnover rate too.
Yeah, and that the concert where the artist partnered with BetterHelp to offer that one free month. I mean, I did see a lot of pushback online as well, and I was glad to see that because I think some of the articles actually raised some of the concerns about, is this just sheer exploitation of tragedy, and how much will this really help? And I'm curious about how that deal came together. But
I'm sure he was approached by BetterHelp. That would be my bet. Yeah, I mean, these apps, it's not just that like they're bad at therapy. They also really do bring with them a whole host of problems. One of which is that, and this came up a lot. I was surprised. I was like, yes, here on all these tweets, BetterHelp is not held to a therapeutic confidentiality standard that you are in your private practice and at scale. So, every 3 months, like clockwork, there's a big story of one of these apps doing some huge or small leak. Sometimes it's human error, like the CEO of Talkspace, I believe it was, CCing a bunch of patients who all belong to the same therapist rather than BCCing. That's human error. That's bad. On the other hand, we also saw this summer one of these apps' entire chatted conversations be leaked because of hacking. And you don't have this problem, obviously, when projects are smaller scale or when they're one-to-one. Again, leaving aside the question of media. So part of it is that corporate impulse to scale. The other thing I always try and make sure to raise is what it's doing to therapeutic labor, right? Where BetterHelp, Talkspace, they're paying really like essentially minimum wage for 30 minutes of therapy. And it's 30 minutes, which means that you can have 2 sessions to the hour. So they're doubling the caseload of therapists with patients, and adding texting, where the sort of therapist has to always be on. And of course, the therapist can't always be on. And it creates problems not just for the patient who feels dropped because they've been promised instant messaging with a therapist, but also for the therapist. And I think, Todd Eisig, your colleague who's been very much involved with PsiAN, is very worried about the futures of therapeutic labor, in its most deep, sometimes, yes, boring details, like the national licensure question, like about true parity for insurance, right? What are the places we can really push back and organize around? And what are places that are less effective to do that? And I think you all, key folks at APSAR, have been very smart about really trying to think about where those places of rejection, resistance, activism really matter. And they do matter right now before this really takes hold even further.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. We are looking for those openings for sure. I wanted to ask you now about something that was really so interesting in the coda of your wrote, I guess, just shortly around the beginning of the pandemic, I believe. And this is about the goals of therapy and the role of empathy. And of course, we're here in Chicago, which is the home of self-psychology. And Kohut, who taught many of us about the important uses of empathy. And some even say therapy is about using our empathy as therapists to understand our patients and help them become more empathic with themselves or with the other people in their lives. And screens, of course, have been shown to reduce empathy. And you say, you talk about empathy as perhaps the wrong goal of therapy and how it can be complicit in social injustice or racism or classism. And I found that so compelling. I was wondering if you could talk about that complicity and how you do see the goals of therapy.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it's intense. I mean, it's not meant to be like annoying or provocative, but this was, again, so if I started the book thinking about why do we assume the mediated experience of care is lesser, when it enfolds many people who otherwise wouldn't, like Freud could not see fleas, right? So like even the very first analysis, little Hans could not leave his house. He was agoraphobic, right? This goes on and on and on, right? Many kinds of patients who need some distance in order to make use of the intense intimacy that therapy can be. And so the idea that screens ruin empathy was also related to that, right? That would be a reason to think the thing is lesser. And I started looking at a lot of those studies and again started to really question how screen, like what's happening on the screen, is presented there. So, you know, at the same time as when the pandemic was winding up, like as opposed to down, which it's sort of stayed there. There are all of these other studies coming out that said, actually, screens are great for teens right now, because otherwise they'd be totally isolated, right? And there has been a huge increase in the rate of suicide and suicide attempt in teenage girls and also in Black youth, two groups who historically are not typically at risk for suicide compared to young white men. So screens actually bring them back in. Get rid of your screen ban became a whole. So it's like, wait, nothing has changed, right? The pandemic has not yet created a revolution or something. Really, it's pressurized certain factors, but the screen hasn't changed. The conditions around it have. So that was kind of the background. And again, everyone would bring up empathy. Empathy is that's what you risk losing. So I started to read about the history of empathy. I can drop stuff in the chat too, because I've written a little bit even more about this beyond the book. You know, empathy, which as a concept is made in a lab, it's a fake concept. It's at first supposed to describe how humans feel about art. So it's about humans and objects and how we can feel for objects. And I argue we kind of never lost that by saying you have to empathize with someone is already creating a kind of objectification of their experience. But also you have to, when I use the word empathy, I'm really using it in its definition. So I think there are all kinds of feelings that might feel like empathy, but what empathy really sort of gestures at is thinking the other person's experience as one's own. And it's a kind of taking over, whereas there are plenty of experiences that I just simply cannot make my own. I don't want to. That's a kind of, bell hooks would call it eating the other. It's a kind of colonization of the other's life experience. But instead I can do other things and not just me, but right, I can be in solidarity with someone, right? So I tried to start thinking about what are these other stances that aren't a rejection of that kind of empathy teaching, but adjust the goal. So that instead of taking on everything of someone else's as my own, which is impossible, we're always going to fail at that, to try and think about what we can do that's about really holding the space, so to speak, for someone else in difference without negating difference, collapsing it via, again, this kind of eating of the other. So it was a kind of gesture away from empathy towards other ways of relating, following thinkers in Black study, Saidiya Hartman, Namwali Serpell, and in queer theory and queer psychoanalytic study, people like Leo Bersani, to think about other ways people have thought about what we might call empathy, but with, again, like a different gesture, right? So it's not about like, it's not an anti-relational thing, but it's about adjusting how we think about what good relations might be. That coming from someone like Kim Tallbear, Indigenous STS scholar, like what are good relations? And is empathy proper to that or not? So that's a kind of really theoretical, there are kind of two major theoretical things that just happened in the coda in the book. That is one, and the other is thinking about how media interact with us psychologically and psychically. There's so much more I can say about that, but perhaps that suffices for now.
I think it's something that we'll really have to struggle with, because I think putting ourselves in the role or the shoe of the others, and psychoanalysis and therapy have focused so long on the individual. I think how can we expand that and broaden that to so that that's not at the expense of understanding or appreciation of the social conditions. I think there's so much there.
Yeah, I've been really sitting with, and for a lot of reasons, thinking about the sort of double, like the double opportunity offered to our more mainstream dominant modes of psychoanalysis over the last, 2 years. Meaning, the crisis of white supremacy in this country is not 2 years old, obviously. It's 400 years old, at least. But there's been renewed attention over the last 10 years, and especially over the last 2 years because of the uprisings of summer 2020. Even though, of course, many psychoanalysts have been working on racism and race and hatred for decades. So it's not to say this is a new phenomenon, it's not. And yet it's really permeated, APSA in a different way, special issues of many journals in a different way, right? What is the social and how do we engage it? And on the other hand, also teletherapy, right? Because the very contours of the practice have shifted overnight. And thinking about both the kind of resistance to the social, because we value we have historically valued what is neutral, and also rejecting mediation in favor of a kind of purity. I actually think they're deeply interlinked, that they're very protective of the thing that psychoanalysis has identified for itself. Again, mainstream dominant psychoanalysis has identified for itself as the thing it can do really well, which is work with individual psyches. And then anything else, I think psychoanalysis historically has responded by making itself quite small. So we had a comment in the chat, right? Like, but no one really wants to do depth therapy. And I'm like, yeah. But when they're interviewed, they do. They just don't. There's no knowledge. And this has really changed, right? Because 50 years ago, there was this real wish for that kind of treatment. In the 70s, it reappeared. And actually, I think it's reappearing now again, which we can talk about too, kind of turn back to psychoanalysis. But I do think that this is something that has to be sorted out, which is the way we navigate not just the individual psyche, but all the forces that shape a psyche. And that also, much less importantly, also includes this question of opening up the frame in terms of access, in terms of money, and relatedly in terms of technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe, this is making me wonder if, therapists can be critical of teletherapy because it does threaten the frame or the therapy hierarchy, and maybe kind of shifts that power dynamic with the patient or the client. And that also opens up all these other, systemic problems that we certainly don't know how to solve at the moment. I will just say, and I think you and I have talked about this before, that we have done directly with the general public here at the Psychotherapy Action Network, we've done qualitative and quantitative research, and we were really amazed and delighted to find that when we just asked people in normal everyday words, what do you want out of therapy? They told us they want depth. They want to get to the root of their issues. They know it's going to take time and be a process, and they're willing to invest in that. And that was, a good 70% of people said that. So I do think there's a huge demand out there. I think people just don't know what it's called, don't know how to find it. All those other kinds of obstacles, of course, cost is still in the way.
I was struck, this is very anecdotal, because I work on what I work on and I'm in the academy. A lot of the time I get asked by either friends or really people I barely know, but are collegial in some way, friend of a friend, a colleague of a colleague, to do referrals, right? To help people find treatment. And sometimes that means like money is no object. Sometimes it means money is totally the object. But I'll always say like, so what do you want? And but I have to start giving a little list. Like, is there a particular neighborhood it has to be? Money, are you thinking a couple times a week? Right, as we start to get into it. And these are people, including who like definitely read Lacan, read Freud. They're scholars. They have unless they ask for psychoanalysis, right, explicitly. But the idea that CBT is different from psychoanalysis is just not even on the radar. And even when money is no object, right, the referral, like, it's just kind of impossible. And it's really upsetting to encounter, right, that even though, APSA has a great find a therapist feature, even Psych Today, there are these, people don't know how to go about it because it's been so removed from the culture as a thing that happens, even though lots of people are in treatment of various sorts, of various stripes. And I think that that's something that Talkspace and BetterHelp have totally locked in, right? Because we'll do it for you. And I do think that that's part of access. It's not just money. Money, I think, is even more important because it's the number one barrier, but it's also this other much more enigmatic thing, which is how do you reach the public and truly communicate the different schools of therapy and what they differently offer.
Yeah, we are definitely working on that and should have some projects to talk about in the new year at PsiAN. So
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah. Linda, do you want to ask a final question of Hannah, and then we'll open up for the audience?
Yeah, I guess I would just be curious about how the pandemic perhaps has changed or influenced your ideas about all of this. You were working on it for so many years, and then there is this global pandemic at the end that forces all of us into technology in new ways, which I find is fascinating timing. I'm just curious how that has affected your theories and your ideas about all this.
Yeah, it was very strange timing. So the book was done, except for the coda. I became useful at all. And that was, I don't know how you felt. I felt totally useless in the face of just mass catastrophe. I'm also from New York, and I was 3,000 miles away as, thousands of people in the city died right away. So I felt whatever that feeling is, that I could help some people, like very small scale, navigate certain changes in their practice, and talk with people about something that was really experienced also as a trauma, which was the mass sudden flip to remote therapy, negotiating what it meant now that there was something very material in the room because there were 2 rooms and there was a Zoom screen, trying to help people think about what HIPAA and its compliances being waived meant, insurance being, totally restructured, however briefly meant, and so on. And then it did help me think through I just tried to really sit and listen to people. I had done so many oral histories for the last 2 chapters of the book, and I revisited many of those people and conducted many more to also have a record of that switch for, and not just say psychoanalysts, but many kinds of therapists are in this book and inform the book. And to see what was happening. And it was really surprising because, yes, some people thought screens were fucking oppressive and then used that language. And other people were stunned that it could go on at all. And that is a constant refrain from the history, right? In the face of crisis, people will try and figure out how to be with one another. And I was really moved that so many people really did immediately figure it out and make use of it, really, which is such an analytic thing. It's not, my mother says this to me, it's not what happens, it's what you make of it, right? And that was the kind of impulse in so many of our communities. It was extraordinary to see.
Absolutely. Yeah, it really was. Well, thank you, Linda, for such interesting, engaging, provocative, eliciting questions. And thank you, Hannah, for the depth and breadth of your knowledge and understanding of this issue. I want to ask people in the audience if they have questions. I see we have one. We have a question here. I guess it's actually a continuation of what you've been saying. But before I get to the question, I just want to comment on people's response to the pandemic, because of course, psychoanalysts and APSA were, and of course the IPA were so opposed to the use of technology in general. And with the pandemic, there was such a change in feeling about it, and the people who were forced to have the experience now could understand that there were ways to establish continuity and relationship and depth and insight, that it wasn't a barrier. It actually, we were so grateful to have it with this pandemic, and it's actually hard to imagine what would happen without it. So with that, let me just ask you this question that's been posed. It's a quote from your book, and it says, "Screens don't destroy empathy, they host its contemporary loss, which is an effect of despair, loneliness, and alienation." And the question is, can you elaborate on this?
Thank you. Thank you, Janice. So that is from the same part of the book that Linda and I were just talking about, this sort of question, like, is empathy the thing to be worried about? And so I'm going through all of the sort of major critiques of teletherapy. So I should say that the book is in no way evangelizing for teletherapy. I'm a historian, but it is pointing to all of these really creative uses of media and technology across its long history, as well as how we ended up in this place with BetterHelp and Talkspace. So there's some like really moving stories of activists doing, I think, quite phenomenal work, and like of evangelical churches doing similar work that's less moving and kind of terrifying and brutal. And same with our contemporary, right? There are these artist projects with AI and therapy that are super incredible, and then there are these corporate things that are terrifying. So one of the questions, again, that's constantly posed to teletherapy is, but you're using a screen, and screens are terrible. That's sort of the criticism, right? And one reason they're terrible, as Linda was saying, is, well, because they destroy empathy. And really what I'm saying in this quote is, screens don't destroy empathy. They host its contemporary loss, which is an effect of despair, loneliness, and alienation. I think that media do things, of course. I mean, I study media for a living, insofar as I have one. And I think that, of course, Zoom has its own affordances, its own textures. I think they're both individual and societal. But that screens are part of the mechanism of late stage capitalism. They're where we work now. They're part of how we relate in a really fundamentally, to my mind, quite ill society, right? One filled with despair, loneliness, and alienation, which are three different things. And I go on to name what they are in the book, right? There are three different terms for what we could also add. Depression would be a fourth one, that have come up across the book. So despair is the Christian term. Alienation is, of course, a Marxist term, but also a state of mind. Loneliness is the constant sort of American nameable, a bad feeling. We're allowed to say we're lonely, but it's harder to say anything else. And I think that screens convey what's there in that way, rather than generate the loss. I don't think screens did it. I don't think they're the culprit. I think that they are complicit and part of and co-sign, right? They are transmitting what's already there. But this is, again, why I'm not so sure that it's media's problem specifically, rather than like the corporation that hosts the technology. I don't know if that's helpful as a kind of shift in where I put the critique. And if that sort of makes sense, if that's what you're asking for, Janice, I'd be happy to say different things if it's not.
Janice, does that answer your question, at least in part? I think it seems to. You know, I want to ask you something about that we didn't get to in the conversation with Linda, but you talk a lot about, or not a lot, but some about crisis hotlines, other kinds of ways in which communities have come together to provide assistance that's not and explicitly not professional. And I'm just curious about the dichotomy of professionalization and these crisis hotlines, and the way in which that has, I'm not even quite sure what the question is, but there seems to be a kind of way in which professionals have not provided something that is needed, and that these other systems found a way to respond to that outside a professional system. But it does set up a kind of dichotomy. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about that.
Thank you for this question. So in the book, I talk about the rise of the crisis hotline, which in the US starts in 1959. And the first crisis hotline is, I want to say out here, but I'm not at home, is out in the Bay Area. It's founded by a man named Bernard Mays. He called himself a closeted queer priest. He eventually comes out. And he noticed that in San Francisco, there were two overlapping groups being onto despair, right, who were despairing. One was the queer community, who were currently in the 50s and 60s, right, being raided all the time by police. And the other was a concentrically overlapping, but not coincidental group who were suicidal. And the Bay Area had the highest suicide rate anywhere in the world, except for West Berlin. This was during the Berlin airlift, okay? So it's not a good time in West Berlin. And San Francisco is number 2, in part because of a kind of iconography around the Golden Gate Bridge, but not only. And Mays was shocked because he felt like San Francisco kind of liked the notoriety and didn't really care about the queer community at all. So he was like, well, how do I help these people and help the ones that want to be helped, right? Not do a kind of intervention on anyone who doesn't want it, but prevention in case you do want to talk to someone. And he set up a hotline. And the hotline was disseminated, a very small scale project, right? It was for San Francisco. It was set up in the Tenderloin district, which, if you know San Francisco, hasn't changed that much. He got a deal on a basement office because his landlord was a psychiatric survivor and was very moved by the project. And he took 30 calls the first month, all advertised. This is my favorite detail in the entire book. He advertised the hotline on the inside flap of matchbooks and dropped them at gay bars. so that you'd go to have a cigarette and you'd flip it open and it would say, thinking of ending it all, call Bruce with the number. And so Bernard Mays hosted this service, 30 calls the first month, hundreds of calls, grew more and more by word of mouth and small, low scale advertising, like clandestine advertising. And within a year, the suicide rate in San Francisco had been cut in half. Why a hotline? This is your question. Why did that work? And why did people, well, the DSM-3 had homosexuality as a disorder. No queer person wanted to go to a psychiatrist for that reason, or very few. And also suicide was a crime, right? And actually in some states, it still is a crime, meaning also attempted suicide is a crime. So you could end up doubly in jail if you went to a psychiatrist or if you called the cops. The cops who are also completely violent to many communities, including this one. So he decided to set up an anonymous peer-to-peer listening service that explicitly rejected all trained workers, like no social workers, no psychiatrists, none, because he wanted his callers to feel completely safe. And that there was a way you could listen exquisitely, was his term, without being trained to be an expert. Because you'd have training. You wouldn't just like throw someone on the hotline. You'd have hours and hours of training into a kind of listening, but without going to say, get your MSW first. And that was like the way that power had to shift for this specific population to make use of this kind of care. And it's always on because it's a hotline. And you can hang up if you're the caller. You don't have to like leave a therapist's office. You don't have to worry that you won't be allowed to leave, right? In terms of, in California, it's a 5150 psychiatric hold, right? There's much more self-reliance in a community effort by its own community. We see that kind of activist mental health care and healthcare project again and again across the 60s and 70s. The Black Panthers work. The Young Lords have a hotline, right? They scale up, but they start really small. And that those are the places that communities that care has not just forgotten, but used care as a form of violence, turn to and can feel safe in turning to, and to receive care that isn't going to be part of these structures of whether it's medical redlining, whether it's homophobia, whatever. So that's one example from the book of that kind of, all authorized in part because of the telephone, right? Where they know everything that a telephone is going to do to intimacy, and they play with it to try and find the right conventions for care. And they were really successful in this case.
Yeah, it is a great story. Okay. We have a question here from Mark Levine. Could you comment on the differences in the experience of screen-mediated therapy and analysis between digital natives and digital immigrants, especially given that most psychoanalysts are digital immigrants?
Yeah. So I think obviously one's experience of media is going to really matter. But not just, I think, in the way that that question is pointing us, which is like materially, but also psychologically and psychically. I'm a middle millennial. I'm 31 years old. Voicemails make me anxious, like really anxious. Really. And if you ask people my age, a little bit younger, a little older, they tend to agree that a voicemail is anxiety inducing because it's too intimate. And that you only really leave one if something kind of bad has happened, right? Or something important has happened. Whereas like texting, email, of course, there's much less of a barrier. The same way that the phone has always been a kind of very intimate medium. So Dorothy Parker has this great quote where she wanted to tell her editor she was not going to get a book in on time. And she sent a telegram because she couldn't look him in the voice of a phone call, right? So what is old is new again. People have their own really psychological relationships to media. I think that, of course, if you go into Zooming with patients, hating the computer or experience. There's something behind that, but also could in part be because of the sort of history of computing. Like we all have very, Freud also always the original. Psychopathology of everyday life, right, is due for an update around these questions, right? Like how and when we are introduced to media, do we then take them on? But I think that it's not just so neat as digital native versus those who come to computing later in life. You can be 55 and had done email in college at this point. So I don't know, most. I think that's also a question. But what I was going to just say I think it's a very worthwhile question. And then also, what about patients who are one and the analyst is the other, or you're both the same? Like, I wonder about that. But again, I also think that there's this assumption that we have to work digitally, right? And by which I think we mean on the screen. Right? I mean, all of our phones are digital now too. So it goes, but we can also talk on the phone if that's the better thing. And I do know that for a lot of analysts making the adjustment, especially if they themselves felt uncomfortable with computing or their patient did, just talked on the phone. And that was okay too, right? So on the one hand, I think there's a lot there, psychological. Materially, I also think we can just do what works. And that is, I think, like a quiet lesson in this book. It's like finding the right medium. Doesn't mean it's the best medium or a perfect medium, but it might be the right one nonetheless. Yeah, but I'll think more about this, Mark. It's a great question.
Actually, that reminds me, could you talk a little bit about your concept of distanced intimacy? We didn't get to that in the.
Yeah, that's sure. So the book is organized around these different genres of intimacy, all of which fall under the sign of distanced intimacy, which I take to mean the kind of relating that is only possible over distance, where distance becomes somehow central to the way the relationality is constructed. So the caller on the hotline is a great example, right? Where they may know the person's voice on the other end of the phone. They might actually always call on Thursday evening at 5:20 so that they hear Linda, right? And they can create a kind of intimacy using the sort of medium-specific affordances of, say, the hotline. But at the same time, the reason they're calling the hotline and it's working is partially because they need the distance as either a protective factor, because embodied intimacy is too much or too little. So we see this with many, many populations, as well as just individuals. People who've had really bad previous therapeutic experiences might want the distance of the phone because they feel able to do it. Or people who have had sexual assault in their past might want some kind of physical distance or might not want to be seen. Right. So I think one thing that happened when we all shift to Zoom for therapy was the patients who didn't want to be seen suddenly. In the office, they have to be seen if their analyst decided, right, at the greeting. But now they could control that and they didn't want to come back on camera. Or conversely, they wanted to use the camera to get, I'm not going to do it, but like really close, right? Or loom over the analyst. So all of those are kinds of features of this distanced intimacy question that are going to be very specific depending on the triad of patient, therapist, and medium, and are culturally situated and configured too.
Well, it's so interesting because one would have to find a way to deal with that, even if one was in person, right? If there's a anxiety about intimacy, you find a way of either not looking or not speaking so fully, or so it's a problem that people solve in all kinds of interesting ways, and technology is one of them. What's sort of the right space between people for any particular person, and how much of that is defensive, how much of it is a matter of where you feel most yourself. It can really range.
Yeah, and I think that that's been a fascinating thing to hear analysts talk about in the pandemic is like how to interpret the media use. Because again, the sort of classic narrative is teletherapy hosts all this loss, right? And on the other hand, well, it also gives us all this other information. Like if your patient is dragging the computer into bed with them repeatedly, or like whatever, you can get this kind of very different set of data, visual data, sonic data, but also because they're less tethered in time and place and space, the frame is cracked open, stretched minimum, cracked open for some. We're going to learn a lot more, not just a lot less. And so I think one thing that a lot of people were looking forward to was taking whatever they had learned in the pandemic as data, interpretive data, back into the consulting room. And I also think that this is something we didn't yet really touch on, but the question of, well, are people going to go back? Which is something we've talked about at PsiAN earlier this summer. And even since June, I think, Linda, was when that was. I think the answers have yet again changed and their implications have again changed. And that was only a few months ago. But yeah, I love all the clinical stories that people have shared of the patient really using like the visual field of Zoom to their psychical stage, right? It's not even to their advantage. Like the pregnant patient who had an entire baby in the pandemic and the analyst never knew. Because, I mean, if I was 9 months pregnant right now, I don't think you could necessarily know that. And I'm not, I'm zero. But like there are all these weird sites of control.
You have to tell me.
I would have to tell you. But you know, like I always use the examples that don't apply to your life. You know, like I think that this is something that's been a kind of interesting window, but I think part of it was kept going by this fantasy of, well, and I'll get to take it back to the original, right? To the couch. And I think people are starting to see that that is either not readily forthcoming now, and starting to get worried that it never will be.
Well, it probably never will be. I mean, we're obviously not going to go back to how it was, but the question is, what's it going to look like going forward?
Yeah. Well, there was a new sort of light quantitative study done that was circulating a bunch today on a bunch of listservs and on Twitter that shows like, yeah, very few people want to go back to the office full time as patients. That patients don't want to go back, which is fascinating, interesting. Therapists, of course, that means 40 hours or plus or more or less of Zoom therapy. For the patient, it might mean 1 to 4 hours of Zoom therapy, right? And so, of course, for them, they might be like, well, it worked and it is more convenient. But I also think that we're living in a culture that's decided a pandemic is over when it's not. In fact, caseloads are rising again in the United States. And that patients and therapists might feel, well, we're being told it's time to go back, but actually I control whether or not I go back here, and I'm not ready. Because there is something about physical proximity in a pandemic where it's aerosols that transmit lethal virus, can be lethal, as we all well to know, that feels actually kind of terrifying. So I've noticed that people are really trying to rethink both the trauma of the absence of the last 2 years and also now feeling presence to be a kind of trauma, right, on the other side. That we're all having to readjust. And so I actually don't think whatever it is we're seeing now in terms of numbers needs to be predictive. I just think it's still really, we are in a pandemic rather than we are in the future that pandemic has brought already.
We don't know yet. Actually, there's a related question here having to do with, Yvette is asking about the use of technology as resistance.
You mean like analytic resistance, like therapeutic resistance?
I think that's what she meant.
Well, because there are also all kinds of activist resistance happening on the same channels. But yeah, okay. Just wanted to make sure. Thank you for that question, Yvette. Well, certainly, right? But the patient can be resistant in the room too by not coming late. I mean, this again is another, not paying the bill on time. I think that it is another avenue that people can use to enact, for sure. What is it also, just like with that hotline, they can hang up on their Zoom therapy much more easily than they can quit a room. And I don't know that that's only good. I mean, obviously, if something very bad is happening, it is good. But otherwise, it's resistance, but with less resistance to the resistance, right? And I also think it's really, again, going to be a matter of, for those who interpret in their practices, who are psychodynamic, psychoanalytic, it's going to be really thorny to try and figure out how to interpret, can I have a phone session today? Now. Whereas I think we really did for a long time kind of know how we were going to interpret, can I have a phone session today for any given patient? As a kind of, whether it's resistance or actually in the transference, countertransference, something feeling uneasy. But now, after 2 years, like, you can't say it's the exception. It's been the rule. And a lot of life has happened there for everyone, So I think it's another place where we need to all reread the psychopathology of everyday life, which is something I've been doing for the past 2 years. And I can't recommend it enough.
Yeah. We have a question here, actually, that's very connected to what you just said. Can you talk to the issue and meanings of changing the frame at the last minute? For example, some patients agree to meet on Zoom and nevertheless show up when the therapist is not in the office, and oppositely, at the last minute, telling the therapist who has traveled to the office to see the patient, and the patient says, I'd rather be on Zoom today.
This sounds annoying, is how it sounds. But I think, that's, I think it's very related in a way to Yvette's question. So yeah, I could feel like, yes. And, students are like this too. Also, like, I need to have an in-person meeting. Actually, I'm on Zoom. Like, I did travel 40 minutes to campus. Thanks so much. For sure. I mean, that's happened a few times, but also, again, I try and think about, well, maybe it's because they thought they wanted co-presence in a room, and at the last minute, they got scared, right? Because we do have, high case numbers in various parts of the country. I don't know, Molly, if you're calling from Chicago. I think that also, for me, it's interesting the way I read it is that the patient who shows up to the office having scheduled Zoom is doing something quite different from their inverse twin in the second half of the question. And I want to think about why that is. That I'm immediately thinking of those as separate gestures, different gestures, one of a kind of longing to be together and the other as a kind of annoying enactment that's really, not considerate. But this is why I am not a psychoanalyst. But I think, yeah, again, the question is, can you talk about it? Can you bring it back into the room? Can you make use of it? Yeah, I think that's always the question. Just like any other change, pre-pandemic, the patient who always shows up on Tuesday, but their session's on Wednesday. Right. There has been a long history. There are new things being introduced because of what the media is carrying, which is now with it, this idea of pandemic and this experience of pandemic. But I also think it's really good to just think about these very fundamental questions like enactment, resistance, and how to handle them.
Yeah. They're, as you say, fundamental. I see that we are at the end of our time, so I do want to thank our audience for being here this evening. I want to thank Linda for her questions and her thoughtfulness in the reading that she did of Hannah's book. And Hannah, I want to thank you for a delightful conversation and for all of the context that you bring to our current sort of stressful lives and questions about how we're going to move to the future. And of course, as I'm sitting here thinking about this, Zoom has made this evening possible, right? You're in Berkeley, you're in LA currently, we're here in Chicago. Some of our audiences, a lot of them are in Chicago, but some are from elsewhere. So there's a coming together that we're very fortunate to be able to have. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Conversation.
Thank you so much, Linda. That was wonderful.
Thank you. I can't wait for your next book.
Me too.
I bet.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us tonight.
Yes, thank you. Good night, everyone.